Welcome back to the Wilderness and Wondrous Love podcast, brought to you by Powell United Methodist Church. My name is Rachel Parfinchuk, and I am Director of Music Ministries.
And I'm Kim LaRue, Director of Adult Ministries, and we're glad you're with us. Our second podcast, we're going to focus on a song that's probably very familiar to you, and you have probably sung it. And it is What Wondrous Love Is This?, which was actually in our hymnal on page 292 in the United Methodist Hymnal. So if you've got one handy, you can pull it out.
Yeah, so what wondrous love is this? Just like Kim said, this is one of the great ones from our United Methodist Hymnal. And this tune, the origins are actually very similar to last week. This is a United States folk tune. So this is something that originated right here in the United States. And it just has such a beautiful melody that is one of my favorite tunes of the season. The version that we actually have in our hymnal was harmonized by Paul Christensen in 1955. But the text and the melody itself, we don't have a specific person who created it necessarily.
So let me tell you a little bit about what I found out about Paul Christensen. Paul Christensen was the son of the gentleman that started the Concordia Choirs in Minnesota, which is, they're very famous choirs. And then Paul Christensen, who they talked about having his own directing style, which is interesting. I'm not sure exactly what that means. Rachel probably knows, but unless we can watch him, I don't know if we can tell you what that looks like. But he has his own directing style, and obviously he also harmonized things and probably also wrote music. The other interesting thing about him is his dad created the Concordia choirs, and then Paul Christensen, who again harmonized our hymnal's version of this, started the St. Olaf choirs, which I'm sure you've also heard of. So they're both very famous choral conductors who have been part of our history in the United States of creating amazing choral experiences for people to listen to and participate in. So that's a little bit about Paul Christensen.
Yeah. So just to kind of go into a little bit about some of the more musical ideas in this hymn, something that I found really interesting is, so we talked a little bit about Paul Christensen, who has harmonized this piece for us. And if we actually look at the harmonies here and we look at, you know, the structure of the piece, you find that this song is written in Dorian mode. So when we talk about modes, we're going to get a little into the weeds here. Normally, we'll talk about major and minor, and those are what kind of create the quality of the song. So we typically associate major with happy music and minor with sad music. Mm-hmm. But in fact, there are quite a few more modes than just our major and our minor mode. So Dorian mode is an example of one of these different key areas that we can have music in. And this mode, just like a lot of the music that you find in Lent, gives us this kind of haunting, open feeling. So when you listen to it, you might not necessarily recognize it as being major or minor, and that's in fact because it's not in either major or minor. It's actually in Dorian mode. So as you listen to this piece, just kind of reflecting on the harmonies and the way that those harmonies make you feel as you're listening to the actual text is something that I find really amazing about this seemingly, you know, simple standard hymn. Yeah. And in fact, it's not. And so this juxtaposition of, you know, the tonality versus, you know, the words, this wondrous love, this is a celebration.
Right. So let me give you a little bit of those words if you're not familiar with this hymn. So it starts out, what wondrous love is this? Oh my soul, oh my soul, oh my soul. And again, we enter this Lenten season with a question. What wondrous love is this? It's very reminiscent of what we heard in I Wonder as I Wander, the pondering of how could this happen? That God, who is love, is coming to us. And it continues with that phrase. That's another interesting thing to me about some of the things we're looking at, Rachel, is this repetitive use of the same phrase over and over and over again. And I think of that as kind of soaking in, that the text is meant to soak into us, to continue to ask that question. And maybe there's some other reason for that, but that's one of the things that it reminds me of. And continuing with this first verse for a second, to bear the dreadful curse for my soul. So love is what is bearing the dreadful curse. The second verse goes, when I was sinking down, and repeated, sinking down, beneath God's righteous frown. So I want to talk for a minute about this aspect of Lent. So in this song, we've entered the idea that we are sinful, that we are broken, that we are wounded, that we are not complete. And this song speaks to that. But what it says at the end of that verse is Christ has laid aside his crown for my soul. So there again is this comfort coming right in. It's like the words of assurance after we've done a prayer of confession, right? You never leave a prayer of confession in worship without the words of assurance coming from the pastor. And that's what these verses are doing also, is yes, but God is with us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I will actually note that the sinking down does not actually show up in our hymnal's version. Verse 2 never references sinking down, but I'm so glad that Kim mentioned that, because there are 6 different verses that exist for this hymn.
Okay.
And there are only 4 that are in our hymnal, and there's quite a few different versions that exist out there, and each verse, as I did some research and looked, it kind of has, different segments of different verses, even kind of patched together in different ways, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that's acceptable, I guess. That's okay to move things around like that, to speak to whatever people you're speaking to, or I guess it's an arrangement, I guess, is what that means.
Yeah, I mean, since this kind of this hymn is, it's a USA folk hymn, folk tune, so the origins kind of grew out slowly, as things took hold and people, started remembering these tunes. So it makes a lot of sense that there would be so many different versions, because we don't really have one specific person who sat down and wrote this. We have so many different versions as it became popular, as it took hold. Maybe this church decided they wanted to sing it this way, and then now we have, all these
That's right,
versions.
because it all would have been just not documented until, like we talked about with John Jacob Niles, who then started documenting.
Exactly.
Okay, I never thought about that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And something interesting about that is, so when we talk about documenting, the United Methodist Book of Hymns was actually the first standard hymnal to incorporate this hymn into their hymnal. So as United Methodists, this is kind of our
That's
hymn.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's very cool. So in the hymnal then, is the third verse to God and to the Lamb, or is it in there somewhere?
It is to God and to the Lamb.
Okay, so I want to talk about that for a minute, because so here we get into some symbolism. Instead of literally talking about specific things that happen in Scripture, here we're nodding to symbolic things. So here, to God and to the Lamb. Well, of course, the Lamb, it's a capital L in the text, which it refers to Jesus. And the lamb is coming out of the Old Testament stories of the lamb being sacrificed for the purification of the people. And so as we move then into the time of Christ, it ends up being that Christ is equated with the lamb. And I believe it's the Gospel of John that kind of makes those parallels happen. And as we continue in this verse, it says, to God and to the Lamb I will sing, to God and to the Lamb who is the great I am. So again, another thing that I love about hymns is when you have studied Scripture and then you get to a hymn, you find these little nuggets of things and you're like, oh, I remember where that is. So I am comes from the conversation Moses has with the burning bush, where Moses says, who are you? And the bush, or God, says, I am who I am. And then John, again, the Gospel of John, picks that up with all of the I am sayings of Jesus. I am. I am. I am the door. I am the way. I am the bread. And so here in this text, again, we have that symbolism of I am, which equates Jesus, the Christ, with God, the Trinity. So we have now, this is not just God sending his son, but it's God's self coming, God who is love. So I think that's really interesting about the symbolism there.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And one more note that I'll say, I was just thinking about this as you were talking. This last verse, so the third verse we said, I will sing, and then I'm looking at our last verse here, and our text ends, I'll sing on, and through eternity, I'll sing on. So I just love the idea of singing being the victory.
Yes.
So they're using this, and when from death I'm free, I'll sing and joyful be. So singing as this victory, I just think is so amazing, because it is. Singing is just such a way of expressing, and I love that we have that in this text.
That's beautiful. All right, so that's our second podcast. We hope you'll tune in with us next week. But this is a production of Powell United Methodist Church, and I'm Kim LaRue.
And I am Rachel Parfenchuk. Thank you for listening.